Good morning. My name is Dana Howse. I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy, and my work is co-supervised by Catherine Lapel and Barb Neese, so I'm sort of co-located between the University of Ottawa and Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'm presenting this morning the Return to Work Among Mobile Workers component of the Partnership Development Grant that Catherine talked about this morning. And I was a research assistant on that particular component. And I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors of this presentation who either worked on this particular component or other components within that Partnership Development Grant who provided mobility-related data from their respective provinces for my analysis. So essentially, the study sought to understand the relationship between work mobility and return to work by exploring what happens when someone works in one place or lives in one place and then works, gets injured, files for compensation, and participates in return to work in another place. How does return to work play out? What might be the challenges? And this research focus largely arose from a review of the return to work literature, which has extensively documented problematic return to work experiences and suggests that return to work processes and requirements are associated with they can adversely affect workers' physical and mental health, financial well-being, and strain their relationships and home lives. And moreover, this research links this workers' suffering with problematic workers' compensation claims. And those can pose significant financial administrative burden for the Compensation Board. So evidence suggests that around 20% of claims that are filed become quite problematic, meaning they're prolonged, complex, and contentious. And while it might only be 20% of claims filed, they account for about 80% of claims-related costs. So there's been a great deal of research then dedicated to the policies and practices that promote return to work. But that research is generally focused on the general working population. And the less research has really looked at more non-standard forms of employment, including mobile workers. And so little research then has considered the mediating effect of work mobility on the relationship between return to work policy and process and those negative impacts that workers experience. Yet work mobility, or extended or complex travel to or within the course of work, is becoming increasingly challenging and complex with the growth in precarious employment and the expansion of the construction and transportation sectors and other sectors such as home care and house cleaning where mobility is very common. So this study component then set out to illuminate the relationship between return to work and work mobility and related consequences for injured mobile workers. And as I say, the presentation brings together findings from the 4 provincial components of the Partnership Development Grant to explore, from the perspective of injured mobile workers, the effectiveness of return to work policies and programs and mobility-related barriers to return to work. And for the purposes of this study, mobile workers are those who work more than 200 kilometers from home. And as Catherine said, that can be within their home province or in another province, or it could also include those working offshore. This study, however, does not consider the return to work experiences of internationally mobile workers, such as temporary foreign workers. So data then was drawn from 13 mobile workers in 4 provinces. And this data was collected in 2 ways, through in-depth interviews with mobile injured workers from Newfoundland, as well as with precarious workers in Ontario and Quebec, some of whom were also mobile workers. And data was also collected, as Nicola presented, from semi-structured interviews with mobile workers in Alberta. So you're going to see some of that qualitative data now from the phase 2 of Nicola's study. So the sample of workers we're looking at here include 4 women and 9 men. And there is a great deal of variation in age, family situations, including those who are single, married, divorced, with and without children. Variation in occupation, so it includes nursing, trades, manufacturing, resource extraction type jobs, different mobility scenarios, including fly in, fly out, and extended intra-provincial and inter-provincial commutes, as well as variation in return to work status and workers' compensation claim status, with those having accepted claims and denied, ongoing, and closed. So a review of the data from these 13 mobile workers reveal that unique return to work experiences and challenges that work mobility can introduce. And it also reveals the ways in which return to work can influence mobility. So in the next few slides, I'm just going to show you some of the key challenges that emerged from these interviews and provide illustrative quotes. Mobile workers described absences from work or modifications to the nature of their work, so to the job itself or the hours worked, that were related to their work injury that disrupted their normal routines at work and at home. And the consequences of these disruptions seem particularly problematic for mobile workers who depend on the consistency of their routines and modes of transportation and travel. So for this woman, she took time away from work due to her injury, but that disrupted her usual rotation, which had previously coincided with her partners, such that as a result of taking the time off, they were then on opposite rotations, leading to very long stretches of time apart. So she says, I was supposed to go on my next shift with my boyfriend, and I couldn't go, so we weren't able to see each other for a month, because after that we're alternating shifts, like his plane would fly out and my plane would fly in sort of thing. And this worker was sent to a different work location to work 2 hours a day as part of his modified work. And this new work location was 2 hours from his original job. So his employer suggested he carpool with other drivers to the new location. But as he says, I was pretty well stranded. I could get a ride there and then be told that I'd have to wait 8 hours to come home. And I'm only supposed to be down there doing 2 hours of work. And so related to these disrupted routines is the extended travel and or time away from home for the return to work requirements such as appointments and treatment. So in some cases, injured workers could return home, but they might still have to travel long distances to specialist appointments or to retraining programs. So for example, if they lived in central Newfoundland but had to regularly drive into St. John's. And for other workers, they couldn't return home to recover, so they had to stay in the work province for potentially prolonged periods of time. And you can see some of these issues illustrated here. So this worker says, this is a worker from Alberta, working in Alberta from Atlantic Canada, who says, my caseworker said he worked here, he got hurt here, he can get treated here. I flew back and forth for treatment 5 times before the surgery. And this person notes, I would have liked to have healed at home. My father died 3 months after. I could have spent the winter with him. So this worker also spent their recovery time in Alberta. And in addition to missing out on family time due to the extended travel between or stays in the work province for treatment or retraining programs, injured workers also suffered from the absence of meaningful family support at a time when they were unwell and likely needed it most. So the workers spoke of feeling lonely and isolated and having to look after themselves. So this worker notes, again, a worker in Alberta from Atlantic Canada, I didn't want to stay in a hotel alone. I wanted to be around family. A case manager was horrendous, said we didn't have the proper medical facilities in my home province, and they wanted to deal with their doctors. And this restaurant worker in Nova Scotia from Newfoundland says, I was very much alone because I had moved from my hometown, so my parents weren't accessible. You're in a new province you've never been in before, you feel alone and isolated, and you have to make ends meet. You have to cut back. And for many of the injured workers, their inability to travel meant their family had to undertake extensive travel. So multiple workers in Alberta noted that their employer flew their spouses or families to their work province when they were unable to travel. For others, the spouses traveled with or drove them to appointments several hours from their home, or sometimes spent extended stays with them in the work province to support their recovery. And you can see some of those experiences illustrated in these quotes. So the first two here are from a worker in central Newfoundland who says, my wife would take me to all my doctor appointments, and if I had to go to St. John's for an appointment, I'd have to stay overnight. And then he says again about retraining, they sent me to St. John's for 5 weeks to another program. They paid for it all, they put me in a hotel, my wife and I. And finally then, this worker in Alberta from Atlantic Canada notes that his wife flew up to help him with his recovery. So he says, after the surgery in Alberta, my wife came to Calgary as a caregiver for 3 weeks, and then I flew home. The mobile workers also described particular kinds of financial hardship associated with their work mobility. So again, this first quote here is from a worker in Alberta, from Atlantic Canada, who said that the Workers' Compensation Board in Alberta wouldn't pay for any health care in their home province, that they must stay in the work province to recover. And the worker decided that they wanted to recover at home, so they took on the cost of that themselves. And they said, I got a local therapist and I paid for it on my own, going through my savings, feeling guilty, paying for it myself, taking it away from my family. And this other worker here describes essentially the strain that the financial hardship had on his family and compromised his ability to see his children. So he says, I have kids that come and see me on the weekends and stuff, but lately I don't encourage them to come because I can't afford to feed them and I can't afford to go get them. And finally, these interviews revealed a policy gap for mobile workers wanting to return to their job at a remote site where they lived in employer-provided housing. And so for these workers, the line between work and home is blurred. And there seems to be no mechanism within the return to work policy or legislation to modify these kinds of living spaces to accommodate return to work. And so the particular example in this study was a fly-in, fly-out worker who requested modifications be made to the employer-provided housing so that she could return to work safely without further risk. But the Workers' Compensation Board had no jurisdiction there or authority to order the employer to make those modifications to the home. So that despite the fact that the worker strongly desired to return to work and was physically able to do the work, she couldn't return because the provided housing wouldn't accommodate her needs. So for mobile workers then, housing may introduce an additional site of possible injury and may also pose an additional barrier to return to work. So in conclusion, then, injured mobile workers may experience unique return-to-work challenges. The requirements of the return-to-work process may not only amplify aspects of work mobility, such as introducing extended travel and time away from home, and then the associated difficulties such as strained family relationships and financial hardship, but it can also introduce new and different forms of mobility for workers. So through accepting modified work at a new work location, or introducing travel for return-to-work programs and treatment and so on. And when work injury renders mobile workers immobile, the mobility and related impacts may be shifted onto family, as is the case of the wife who flew to Calgary to help her husband recover from his surgery, or the wife who made multiple multi-hour trips to St. John's with her husband for treatment and retraining. And finally, policy gaps such as those related to employer-provided housing can impede the return to work of mobile workers. And more research is merited to examine the ways employer-provided housing and other non-work spaces in these remote sites are defined and governed in return-to-work legislation and practice.